Darius Jackson faced off against Judge Evelyn Carver in a courtroom showdown, her arrogance no match for his resolve. What happened next delivered justice in a way no one saw coming and changed a life forever. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, do you believe justice always prevails? If you're hooked on stories like this, hit that subscribe button. Another epic tale drops tomorrow. On March 5, 2025, the air inside the Hawthorne County Courthouse in Eltonville crackled with tension, heavy like a storm about to break. Darius Jackson, a 48-year-old black attorney, stepped through the double doors, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor with a rhythm that spoke of purpose. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The worn wooden benches, the restless gallery, the faint hum of anticipation. He carried himself with a rare confidence, the kind forged from years of fighting battles no one else dared touch. Across the room, behind the towering judge's bench, sat Evelyn Carver, a 62-year-old woman who'd wielded her gavel for 25 years. Her reputation preceded her, a judge known for blatant bias, her rulings a quiet terror for anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of justice, especially attorneys like Darius. Today he stood for Jamal Carter, a young man wrongfully accused of armed robbery, a case stacked against him from the start. The moment Darius approached the defense table, Carver's cold voice sliced through the air. "Mr. Jackson," she said, her tone dripping with disdain, "I don't have time for your theatrics today." Darius tightened his grip on his briefcase, but his face remained a mask of calm. The courtroom wasn't just a room, it was a battlefield, and Carver had ruled it like a dictator for decades. Her silver hair was pulled back tight, her thin lips set in a permanent line of judgment. She barely glanced up from her papers, but when she did, her eyes locked onto Darius with a hostility that needed no words. She'd seen men like him before, black attorneys who dared to challenge her, and she'd crushed them all. Or so she thought. For 25 years, her word had been law, her rulings a pattern of prejudice no one could prove in writing, but everyone felt in their bones. Attorneys whispered about it in hallways, their voices low with resignation. Defendants, especially black ones, knew their odds were slim the moment their case landed in her docket. But Darius wasn't just any attorney. He'd built his name taking the cases others ran from, dismantling prosecutions with a precision that made him a legend in Eltonville and beyond. Today wasn't just about Jamal. It was about something bigger, something Carver couldn't see coming. Jamal sat beside him, shoulders slumped, hands clasped tight in his lap. At 24, he already carried the weariness of a man twice his age, too many run-ins with a system that never gave him a chance. The charge was flimsy, a convenience store robbery caught on grainy footage, a witness too shaky to trust. But in Carver's courtroom, evidence didn't matter as much as her mood. Darius leaned over, his voice low but firm. "We've got this," he said. Jamal nodded, though doubt flickered in his eyes. The gallery buzzed faintly, reporters, onlookers, a few regulars who came to watch Carver's show. Up front, the prosecutor, Ryan Mitchell, a young hotshot with slick-back hair and a smug grin, shuffled his notes. He'd barely been out of law school 2 years, but he knew how to play Carver's game. "Counsel," Carver snapped, cutting through the murmurs, "let's get moving. Mr. Jackson, I assume you're ready to waste my time again?" Her words were a jab, sharp and deliberate, meant to rattle him. Darius straightened, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I'm ready to defend my client, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady as steel. Carver smirked, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. She adjusted her glasses and waved a hand. "Fine, let's see how long you last today." The trial hadn't even started and already the lines were drawn. Darius knew what he was up against, but so did she, and that was her first mistake. The trial kicked off, but it wasn't a contest of law. It was Evelyn Carver's personal stage, and she played the lead with ruthless precision. From the moment Ryan Mitchell, the ambitious young prosecutor, opened his mouth, Carver tilted the scales. She dismissed every argument Darius threw her way with a flick of her wrist, her rulings sharp and final like a guillotine dropping. Mitchell, barely 28, stood at the prosecution table, his tailored suit and cocky grin screaming privilege. He stumbled through his opening, tripping over legal terms, but Carver didn't care. She leaned forward, her voice smooth as she guided him. "Mr. Mitchell, just stick to the facts. The jury doesn't need a lecture," she said, casting a pointed glance at Darius as if to say, "Unlike some people." Mitchell nodded eagerly, practically glowing under her favor. Darius watched it all, his jaw tight, taking mental notes. This wasn't justice, it was a puppet show, and Carver held every string. Darius stood to counter, his voice steady as he laid out Jamal's defense. A shaky timeline, a witness with no credibility, and footage too blurry to pin on anyone. Each point was airtight, backed by precedent, but Carver cut him off mid-sentence. "That's enough, Mr. Jackson. I've heard this song before. Move on." Her tone was ice, her eyes daring him to push back. He didn't flinch. "Your Honor? I'm entitled to present my case," he said, calm but firm. She smirked, leaning back in her chair. "You're entitled to what I allow, Counselor. Sit down." The gallery shifted uncomfortably, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Even the jurors, 8 men and 4 women, a mix of ages and races, frowned, sensing the imbalance. But Carver didn't notice, or didn't care. She thrived on control, and Darius was a threat she intended to squash. Then came the bombshell. Halfway through Mitchell's case, Darius caught it. A police report slipped into evidence, one he'd never seen in discovery. It claimed Jamal's fingerprints were at the scene, but the date was off, and the chain of custody was a mess. He rose, holding the paper like a weapon. "Your Honor, this report wasn't disclosed to the defense. That's a clear Brady violation. Brady v. Maryland 1963. I move for an immediate mistrial." The room stilled, all eyes on Carver. Mitchell froze, his smugness fading as he fumbled for a response. Carver didn't blink. She leaned forward, her lips curling into a sneer. "Motion denied, Mr. Jackson. Don't waste my time with your little tricks." Darius held her gaze, his voice even. "To clarify, Your Honor, you're dismissing a violation of due process?" Her sneer faltered, just for a second before she snapped, "I said denied. Next move or I'll hold you in contempt." The threat hung heavy, but Darius sat, his silence louder than any protest. Next up was the witness, Lisa Hayes, a nervous 30-something clerk from the robbed store. Mitchell questioned her with rehearsed ease, leading her straight to Jamal. "You saw the defendant that night, didn't you?" he pressed. Lisa fidgeted, her hands twisting in her lap. I think so," she mumbled, her eyes darting to Carver. The judge leaned in, her voice sharp. "Answer clearly, Miss Hayes, yes or no." Lisa swallowed hard. "Yes," she said, but it sounded forced, brittle. Darius stood for cross-examination, his tone gentle but probing. "Ms. Hayes, how well lit was the store? How far were you from the robber?" She hesitated, glancing at Carver, who glared back. "It was dim, maybe 20 feet, she admitted. "So, you're not certain it was my client?" Darius pressed. Before she could answer, Carver slammed her gavel. "That's enough, Mr. Jackson," she said. "Yes, move on." Lisa flinched, and Darius paused, letting the jury see the coercion. "Your Honor, I'm entitled to her full response," he said, his voice a quiet challenge. Carver's face twitched. "You're entitled to nothing unless I say so. Sit down, or you're done." The room buzzed louder now. Reporters scribbled, jurors shifted, and Jamal whispered, "She's railroading us, man." Darius didn't look at him, his eyes locked on Carver. She was unraveling, her control slipping with every push he made. He'd been in hostile courts before, but this was a beast of its own. Carver wasn't just biased. She was a tyrant, and she'd just handed him the rope to hang her with. He sat, folding his hands, waiting for her next mistake. It wouldn't be long. Darius faced Lisa Hayes across the courtroom, his questions cutting through the haze of her testimony like a surgeon's blade. "Miss Hayes," he began, his voice steady and deliberate, "you said you saw my client that night, but it was dark, wasn't it? And you were 20 feet away. How sure are you it was Jamal Carter?" Lisa's eyes flickered, caught between Darius's calm intensity and the weight of Evelyn Carver's glare from the bench. She licked her lips, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure. It could have been someone else." The admission hung in the air, fragile but damning, a crack in the prosecution's flimsy case. The jury leaned forward, a ripple of surprise passing through their faces. Even Ryan Mitchell, perched at the prosecution table, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence shaken. But before the moment could settle, Carver's gavel crashed down, once, twice, 3 times, each strike louder than the last. "Enough!" she bellowed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "One more word, Mr. Jackson, and I'll have you locked up for contempt." The threat landed like a thunderclap, silencing the room. Darius stood still, his expression unreadable, but inside his pulse quickened, not from fear but from the thrill of the fight. He'd seen judges like Carver before, drunk on power, blind to their own unraveling. She was losing her grip and he could feel it. The gallery buzzed faintly, a mix of shock and unease, but Carver's fury drowned it out. Her face flushed red, her thin lips trembling with rage. "You think you can turn my courtroom into a circus?" she spat, pointing the gavel at him like a weapon. "I've dealt with your kind for 25 years, and I'm not about to let you disrespect me now." The words, "your kind," hit the air like a slap, their meaning clear to everyone. Jamal clenched his fists under the table, muttering, "She's crazy, man." Darius didn't respond, his eyes locked on Carver. She'd just made it personal, and that was a mistake he'd use. The tension spiked higher when Sarah Klein, a young reporter in the back row, fumbled with her phone, the faint click of a recording app betraying her. Carver's head snapped toward the sound, her glare zeroing in. "You—" she barked, jabbing a finger at Sarah. "What do you think you're doing?" Sarah froze, her notepad slipping to the floor. I'm just taking notes, Your Honor," she stammered. Carver wasn't buying it. "Recording my courtroom without permission? Get out now!" She slammed the gavel again, the crack splitting the air. A bailiff lumbered over, ushering Sarah toward the doors as she protested. "This is public record!" The gallery erupted in whispers, some outraged, some nervous, while reporters beside her scribbled furiously. Darius watched it all, noting the jury's reaction. A middle-aged woman in the front row frowned, her arms crossed. A younger man beside her shook his head slightly. They were seeing it now, the mask slipping, the tyrant exposed. Carver didn't care. She sat back, smoothing her robe as if nothing had happened, convinced she was untouchable. "Mr. Jackson," she said, her voice cold again, "if you're done wasting my time, sit down. We're moving on." Darius tilted his head, just enough to signal he wasn't rattled. "For the record, Your Honor, you've prevented the witness from fully answering. The jury deserves to hear her doubt." Carver's eyes darkened, her knuckles whitening around the gavel. "The jury hears what I decide they hear," she snapped. "One more stunt, and you're finished." Darius nodded slowly, taking his seat, but the room felt different now, electric, unstable. The jurors exchanged glances, their discomfort plain. Jamal leaned over, his voice low. "She's scared, ain't she?" Darius didn't answer, but a faint smile tugged at his lips. Scared or not, Carver was digging her own grave, and he was content to let her keep swinging the shovel. The courtroom clock ticked on, each second a countdown to something bigger. Carver thought she'd won this round, but Darius knew better. She'd crossed a line, several in fact, and the reckoning was closer than she realized. The courtroom hummed with tension, a pressure cooker ready to blow, when suddenly the heavy double doors swung open with a groan that silenced every whisper. 2 federal agents strode in, their dark suits crisp against the chaos of the room. The first, Agent Brooks, a tall man with a clipped voice and graying temples, led the way. Behind him came Agent Torres, shorter but no less imposing, her sharp eyes scanning the space. All heads turned, the jury included, as Brooks raised his badge, the FBI seal glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Judge Evelyn Carver," he said, his tone flat but commanding. "We need to speak with you immediately." The words landed like a grenade, and for a split second the room held its breath. Carver's head jerked up, her gavel frozen mid-air, her face a mask of irritation morphing into disbelief. "I'm in the middle of a trial," she snapped, her voice a low growl, as if she could scare them off with sheer will. Agent Torres stepped forward, unfazed, pulling a folded paper from her jacket. "We have a warrant for your arrest, Your Honor," she said, her words cutting through Carver's bluster like a knife. "Suspicion of corruption, abuse of power, and violations of federal civil rights law." The gallery gasped, a collective intake of air that rippled through the benches. Jamal's eyes widened, darting to Darius, who remained still at the defense table, his hands folded neatly, his expression serene. Carver slammed her gavel down, the crack echoing like gunfire. "This is outrageous," she barked. "You can't barge into my courtroom and—" Brooks interrupted, his voice steady. "We can and we are. This is federal jurisdiction. Step down, Judge." Her jaw tightened, her knuckles white around the gavel, but the agents didn't budge. The power she'd clung to for 25 years was slipping, and everyone could see it. Darius rose slowly, deliberately, drawing every eye to him. The room shifted, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He adjusted his tie, his movements calm, almost casual, then turned to face Carver. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low but clear, I've been working with the FBI for years, 3 to be exact, gathering evidence of your misconduct. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Carver's eyes locked onto his, narrowing to slits, but for the first time there was a flicker of something new in them. Fear. Every bribe you took, Darius continued, every case you rigged, every time you silenced a defendant or an attorney because of who they were, I documented it. You thought you were untouchable, but the law doesn't bend forever. The gallery erupted in murmurs, reporters scribbling so fast their pens scratched audibly. The jury sat frozen, mouths agape, as the myth of Carver's invincibility crumbled. Carver leaned forward, her voice trembling with rage. "You?" she hissed, pointing at him. "This is your doing?" Darius met her glare, unflinching. "No, Your Honor, this is yours. I just made sure it caught up with you." Brooks stepped closer to the bench, his badge still raised. "Evelyn Carver, you're under arrest. Stand up or we'll remove you ourselves." She didn't move at first, her chest heaving, her mind racing for an escape that didn't exist. Then slowly she rose, her robe rustling as she straightened. The agents flanked her, Torres pulling out handcuffs with a metallic clink that echoed in the stunned silence. Carver's hands shook as they snapped shut around her wrists, the sound a final note in her reign. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, a chaotic symphony of disbelief and vindication. Ryan Mitchell slumped in his chair, pale and silent, his notes forgotten. Jamal turned to Darius, his voice a whisper. "You planned this?" Darius nodded once, his eyes still on Carver. "Years in the making," he said. The agents led her toward the side door, her head high but her steps unsteady. She shot one last look at Darius. Hatred, yes, but also defeat. The doors closed behind her and the room exhaled, but Darius knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The cuffs clicked shut around Evelyn Carver's wrists, a sharp final sound that reverberated through the courtroom. She stood at her own bench, no longer a judge but a prisoner, her face contorted with fury. "This is Jackson's conspiracy!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she jabbed a cuffed hand toward Darius. The accusation ignited the room. Chaos erupted like a dam breaking, shouts from the gallery, chairs scraping as people surged to their feet. Carver's fall was no longer a quiet reckoning, it was a public unraveling, raw and unscripted. Darius stood at the defense table, his posture unchanged, his eyes cold and steady as he watched her implode. The woman who'd ruled this room for 25 years was now a cornered animal, and he'd brought the trap. Then came the shockwave. Ryan Mitchell, the young prosecutor who'd basked in Carver's favor, bolted upright, his face pale and slick with sweat. "It's true!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the din. Heads whipped toward him, the gallery falling into a stunned hush. "She forced me, made me fabricate evidence, not just this case, but others." The confession landed like a bomb, splintering what little order remained. Gasps rippled through the jury, their eyes darting between Mitchell, Carver, and Darius. Carver's head snapped toward Mitchell, her glare venomous. "You lying little," she started, but a bailiff stepped in, blocking her view. Mitchell kept going, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "She threatened my career, said I'd never work again if I didn't play along." The gallery exploded again, voices overlapping in a roar of outrage and disbelief. The chaos turned physical. A cluster of Carver's supporters, gray-haired regulars who'd cheered her rulings for years, pushed toward the bench shouting, "Let her go, this is a disgrace." One man, red-faced and burly, tried to shove past a bailiff yelling, "She's innocent!" The officer wrestled him back, barking orders as more guards rushed in. Another woman, clutching a purse like a weapon, screamed, "Jackson framed her!" The jury shrank back, their faces a mix of confusion and fear, unsure who to trust in the storm of accusations. A young juror in the back row whispered to her neighbor, "Is this even real?" The older man beside her just shook his head, lost in the madness. Darius remained an island of calm amid the tempest. He folded his arms, his gaze fixed on Carver as the agents held her steady. She thrashed once, twice, then stilled, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a rage that couldn't save her. Mitchell sank into his chair, hands trembling, his career unraveling with every word he'd just spoken. The gallery's uproar grew deafening. Some cheered Darius, others cursed him, a split that mirrored the fracture Carver had carved into this community over decades. Jamal leaned close, his voice barely audible. "You knew he'd crack, didn't you?" Darius gave a slight nod, his lips a thin line. "Men like him always do when the shield's gone," he murmured. Carver's supporters kept pushing, their shouts blending into a wall of noise, but the bailiffs held the line. The agents tightened their grip, ready to drag her out. She locked eyes with Darius one last time, her voice a hiss over the clamor. "You'll pay for this." He didn't blink. "I already have," he said, soft but steel-edged. The room spun around him, jury, gallery, Mitchell's broken confession. But Darius stood firm, watching his enemy's empire burn. The gavel lay abandoned on the bench, a relic of a reign that had just ended in handcuffs. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Carver, leaving a void that swallowed the chaos. Minutes later, Judge Harold Grayson, a stooped man with gray hair and a reputation for fairness, was rushed in to take over. The gallery settled, the jury sat straighter, and Darius stood once more. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the storm he'd just weathered, "given the corruption exposed here, I move to dismiss all charges against Jamal Carter." Grayson peered over his glasses, his lined face unreadable. "On what grounds, Mr. Jackson?" Darius squared his shoulders. This trial was tainted from the start. Judge Carver's bias, her coercion of witnesses, her manipulation of evidence. "My client never had a fair shot." Grayson nodded slowly, then turned to Ryan Mitchell, who sat slumped and silent. "Any objection?" Mitchell shook his head, defeated. "No, Your Honor." A pause, then Grayson spoke. "Charges dismissed. Mr. Carter, you're free." The cuffs came off Jamal's wrists, and he exhaled, a shaky grin breaking through. "Thank you, man," he whispered to Darius, who clapped his shoulder but said nothing. Then came the twist. Darius pressed further. "Your Honor, what about Carver's other cases? Her arrest proves a pattern, decades of injustice." Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "I sympathize, Mr. Jackson, but without specific evidence for each case, my hands are tied." The words hit like a punch. Darius's jaw tightened, but he nodded, stepping back. The system he'd fought to fix was still a wall, unyielding. Hours later, word spread. Carver had been released on bail, a legal loophole citing procedural errors in her arrest. The news stung, a bitter echo of her promise, "You'll pay for this." The courtroom emptied, leaving Darius alone. He stood at the defense table, staring at the vacant judge's bench where Carver had ruled like a queen. The gavel sat still, a hollow symbol now. He'd won today. Jamal was free, Carver exposed. But the victory felt thin. She was out there, her legacy of ruined lives untouched, the system shielding her even in disgrace. Darius ran a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. "Is justice real?" he murmured, "or just a story I keep telling myself?" The silence answered back, cold and empty, as he turned and walked out, the weight of tomorrow already pressing down. Darius walked out, the courtroom's silence a heavy reminder. Justice isn't guaranteed. It's fought for, and even then, it can slip away. Carver's fall was a win, but her freedom showed the system's cracks. The lesson? Power bends the law until someone dares to push back. And even then, the fight's never over. What do you think? Can one person really change a broken system, or are we all just chasing shadows? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us, have you ever seen justice fail? Subscribe for more stories like this. Next time, we're diving into another battle you won't believe.